Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. At first glance, the parallels between the decades-long embargo of Cuba and the rise of New York City's homeless population may not be very clear or apparent. On further reflection, it's crystal clear. The Cuban Revolution, even with its faults and shortcomings, represents a formidable example of a people who've dared to collectively build a society based on dignity, equality of all people, and everyday work that tries to minimize and eliminate historic oppression. All this in the face of a blockade that the United States has unilaterally imposed for over 6 decades. A blockade that has been rebuked and overwhelmingly condemned by the United Nations General Assembly 30 times. Cuba offers an alternative to many of the policies in the United States, a constant reminder of an alternative to the rising inequality, racism, and suffering that tens of millions of Americans face every day of their lives. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in the devastating rising rates of homelessness in New York City, which has reached the highest levels since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Nearly 1 in every 120 New Yorkers are homeless. Over 70,000 men, women, and children. It's no surprise to any New Yorker that the primary cause of homelessness is lack of affordable housing, created and perpetuated by political and economic forces of a deeply flawed system. The immediate triggering causes are eviction, doubled up or severely overcrowded housing, domestic violence, job loss, and hazardous housing conditions. My guest today on the Radical Imagination is Zool Zulkowitz, a conceptual artist, producer, and scriptwriter who has worked in every production capacity over 100 Hollywood on Hudson movies and television shows. Zool is a lifelong anti-war and eco-social justice activist and the founding member of the collective, and I love this title, The Art and Politics of Justice and Joy. He's recently returned from a historic 2-week trip to Cuba with over 150 other activists from various delegations where they met, broke bread with the Cuban people, and took part in Cuba's May Day celebrations to celebrate the progress and development of the nation. Zool is also a lead organizer with the Street Homeless Advocacy Project, an initiative to reach out to our homeless brothers and sisters to provide housing, food, and meaningful connections, reminding them that people care, helping build their future, and breaking the blockade our society has created to decent, affordable housing for millions. So Zool, as always, it's a pleasure and a joy to see you again. We have become friends, rapidly growing. Our rapidly growing friendship has been something that has meant so much to me, and you're a kindred soul, and it's just a joy and pleasure to have you on and help us understand what's going on in Cuba and among the homeless, because you really are on the front lines there. And every movement needs a Zool. And if we are so grateful to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much, Jim. And it's always a pleasure to be with you. I think you put it right at the very beginning. Historic and ongoing oppression, here and around the world. And, this country, the right. Great superpower in rapid decline, shooting itself and everyone else in every direction right now. but historic and ongoing oppression. Here we see on every street corner people who are disturbed, distressed, seemingly discarded. And you don't see that in Cuba, though they have many problems. I think you're right. I mean, the revolution certainly has shortcomings, but there is an ongoing revolution there. I was a part of the May Day brigades this year, last week of April, first week of May.
Zool, tell our audience how this came about. How did you get involved, and so on? Just the basic of how you got to go there.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, and I love the islands, particularly Puerto Rico. But I've long been interested in Cuba, and I thought that I'd like to go as part of an arts and activist delegation. So I'd been looking into that for some time. I became particularly interested years ago reading Assata Shakur's book. So this was very important. And then, hearing Fidel Castro's speeches and hearing from friends of mine who had visited and who had lived there and who had family there and so on. And of course, they had such huge impact in this country because of what's happening in Florida with the anti-Castro Cubans. But I heard of it through a friend of ours. I think you may have met her, James. She's an attorney in D.C., Ann Wilcox. She works with many of us, groups from Code Pink to Veterans for Peace when we do actions down there. And she had been on this trip in the past. And as I was discussing, she said, "Oh, you really want to go with the May Day Brigade?" So that's how I got involved in it. And as I say, it's my brigade was mostly very young people, 20-nothings from all across the United States. Although there were a number of elders, I was one of the younger elders.
Good for you. All right. Are the older youngers, whatever you are? It was wonderful. Yeah. So for the first time, you actually saw what was going on there, and you were not restricted, were you, in terms of where you could go and talk to her? How did that?
It was very highly scheduled. Normally, the many different brigades get together an international camp they have outside of Havana, but because of the fuel shortages, they weren't able to do that. So we were put up mostly Americans and later on with some of the Canadians and British, sadly only English speakers, in what really were 3-star hotels. That they use for tourists because they do have an industry there. So in Havana Playa, a ways from downtown, and then later on in central East Coast Cuba, Sancti Spiritus, beautiful, beautiful place. So basically, we stayed in these places, really apart from the Cubans. In Havana, we were just outside the Center for Biotechnical Research. That's where they did all the work on the 5 COVID vaccines they came up with, 2 of which were very, very good. And they really could have distributed all around the world had they been able to. It's the hundreds of sanctions and Trump putting Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which they certainly are not, which we are, sadly. And sadly, Biden doing nothing about that.
Did they offer us the vaccines too? They offered,
and they had in the past, at 9/11, and I think during Katrina and other times, they've offered to send doctors over here. We export weapons. They export doctors, and they're all over the world, and they're in great demand. But we were at many lectures. They kept us very busy. They kept us rather contained, I have to say. But we were. I thought, really one of the most outstanding things that we did was what they call an encuentro. Some of the guests may know that word. It's essentially a general assembly of people all over the world, very much like the United Nations, minus the Security Council. What a different world it would be, a United Nations minus the Security Council.
So you attended that? You went to that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. That was in their Palace of Summits, the Habana Convention Center. And that was all 30 delegations and labor leaders, indigenous leaders, feminist leaders, so many extraordinary activists, wonderful folks, authors, artists of all sorts from all over the world. Many officials, the Cuban president was there, spent the day with us, didn't give the keynote until, mid-afternoon. We had a beautiful lunch afterwards. Had it been Fidel, it would have been a late night supper.
Yes, 6-8 hours, right? So this president was what, an hour? Kept it under an hour?
Yeah, a little more than that, and he was very authentic. I felt, I never heard a politician other than Ralph Nader speak like that. But the major issue that they do point to again, and which our brigade was, really on about, throughout the trip, are these hundreds of sanctions. This embargo that is keeping Cuba from really taking its place in the world. And they remain a lighthouse. As many shortcomings as there are, and they are, and as infected as they are by toxic culture, which is worldwide, it still is a lighthouse. The socialist project is alive and well and really worth seeing. And I'm looking forward to going back.
Absolutely. Do you want to touch again briefly on some of the shortcomings for our audience to further understand?
Well,
as well as the wonderful impressions you did have.
Yeah.
What they're doing right, what they're doing,
Well, part of it, part of it is really, the toxic culture that's worldwide. So, they have television and they have the internet, and they're as glued to their screens and their ears plugged in as anyone else in the world these days. So distracted from distraction by distraction, as T.S. Eliot says. And so, and they're getting a sense of what their cousins or would-be cousins in Florida are doing and how they're living, and they want to be millionaires too, some of them. And when you go out to the villages, you see they have very little. And, when you go down the road, as we did in these, modern Chinese buses, you see lots of people standing by the side of the road trying to catch public transportation, going down in these ancient American cars, riding in horses and buggies. Listen, any vehicle, any machinery that was in use 100 years ago, 50 years ago, they're making it work, and to a great extent. I mean, that says so much for their resilience. So that's extraordinary. But
so Zool, what you seem to be saying is, again, it's impossible to imagine, but if there wasn't an embargo, this project, as you say, the socialist project could have been much further along. Can you radically imagine that occurring? What do you think?
Yes, because they have made compromises, just as the Chinese made compromises. They haven't been defeated like the Soviets. They're not a capitalist Russia, and yet the people really want more, I think. I mean, so many, you see, they're getting up very, very early to wait online for bread and milk at the the government bodegas. But there is a lot of entrepreneurship. But sadly, a lot of those entrepreneurs are highly trained engineers and others who otherwise pay just a few dollars.
And there's no open signs of rebellion or dissension against all of this.
I did not witness that. I
so people are committed to this ideal, as difficult as it may be, of this collective taking care of or betterment of all people.
I don't think I've spent enough time there to say that. I'm sure there is dissension, without a doubt. Certainly there's a reactionary movement. Certainly the United States and, other imperialist powers, have their fingers on the scale there. There's no doubt about that. But they've made changes in their constitution, in their laws, and now you can vote for authorities in the different municipalities now. So there are ongoing changes there.
Okay,
but
didn't Biden?
And they would like to trade, and they certainly need investments. And, in China, which is making such an impact all over the world, certainly throughout the rest of South America, Asia, Africa, building this infrastructure for so many folks, they still want a return on their investment. And I understand that, the Cubans still don't allow foreign investors to own property there. So that's highly problematic for them. And so some of the things that they need to do, in terms of tourism for one, and the sugar industry for another, it's a cash crop. So that, they've got bills to pay. They don't have the support. Fuel is not cheap anymore. And people are having a hard time.
Well, didn't things open up a little bit?
Yes.
2016, what were the years where things were a little more open? There was more travel there, and then things closed up again with Trump. Is that what was
Obama had given a little bit of an open, not very much, and then Trump really went terribly in the other direction, and Biden's done nothing to counter that, and I don't know why. I mean, he's going to lose Florida anyway, so I don't know why. But I think we certainly have an anti-communist movement in this country still, and I don't. The Communist Party does hold power there, and I don't think everybody's happy about it. But I have to say, when you're in Cuba, you don't see disturbed, distressed, discarded people on the street corners. With their little gardens and, selling crackers from their door, or selling the most delicious Cuban coffee for a couple of cents, out of their homes, And
I know you're a coffee lover, aren't you? Yes. So you must now. Also, you told me you had a few cigars too, or what?
No, it was odd because there's so much smoking. And,
there is,
and if you're by the side of the road, I mean, the exhaust is horrible, and so I developed a cough right away. So no cigars.
Because you were threatening and promising that.
I had promised myself a cigar on May Day, but they canceled the May Day march in Revolutionary Square for the first time in their history. Wow. So they didn't have that, and then they had some very threatening storms as well. So what they ended up, they moved it to Friday, the 5th of May, and they had local celebrations all around the country. That was quite nice.
So it was quite. So was it festive? Was it joyous?
It was. And listen, it's the Caribbean, I mean, it's a wonderful lifestyle. And I think also, just in terms of the project, one of the people that we heard in one of the lectures at the the Technical Center was a Cuban economist, Gladys Hernandez. And one of the things she said that I think was quite remarkable for an economist anywhere to say, she said, here in Cuba, we work to live. Happiness is important. And that's a very important word. She's talking about happiness.
Yes.
People want happiness as opposed to success. All over the world, people confuse success and happiness. They think success is going to give them happiness, and one has really nothing to do with the other.
Yeah, we've tied it into materialistic monetary gain, and I'm sure you've seen this article in the Times, came out May 14th. The greatest wealth transfer in history is here, with familiar rich winners. In an era of surging home and stock value, U.S. family wealth has soared. The trillions of dollars going to heirs will largely reinforce inequality. And we're talking about generations here. And again, as we know, 1% controls 90% of the wealth, and it's only getting more and more tense here. And again, so the segue into the conditions that we see here in New York City among the homeless. And God knows there's the money, but it doesn't. Why do we need to restrict our attempts to build affordable housing? in the city and across the country, for that matter.
It was really a brilliant connection that you made in your introduction, between Cuba as a socialist project. And as I'm saying, this economist relayed to us, we work to live. Happiness is important. And they mean all the people, they really do.
Yeah.
And, and here and in so much of the world, I mean, we live in a global capitalist political economy. The Chinese communists are the best at it as a party, but that's really what it is. And so, yeah, inequity is what it is. Capitalism produces wealth. It produces more and more wealth for fewer and fewer people. So there are folks in the middle. And of course, the term middle class is a horrible term, invented by the bourgeoisie to separate working people from working people, to make white collar people think that they're more important as workers than blue collar people. But, that's a great shame. Here in New York, real estate is what oil is in Texas. This is the power. And this what controls our politics, sadly to say. Every mayor, even if they go for the public funding we've got, they're still totally influenced by the real estate development agency. And that's who we still have building our housing. And it really can't be done. We have to have, public supportive housing. So you could do public nonprofit development. There are a lot of people doing that. The Doe Fund is a great example in doing that. George McDonald years ago, he got down in Grand Central in the 80s when homelessness was as severe as it is today. I mean, it's so those of us who involved then with the startup of the Coalition for the Homeless, Interfaith Assembly on Homeless and Housing, all of these different groups, we're seeing it again. And that brings us into this other project with which I'm involved.
Yeah. Please give us a foundation to understand that, because it's really interesting, very exciting.
Yes. Yeah, this is Norman Siegel's, brainchild. Most people in town, many listeners will know Norman as the former executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union and all the great work he did over the years around police brutality, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, housing and homelessness. I mean, so many things. The First Amendment, where he's really, such a great expert. So he had this idea, and he brought together a few people. Bob Hayes, who founded the Coalition for the Homeless, after he, as a young attorney in 1979, won the right to shelter in New York State. We're still the only state that allows that. Harriet McDonald.
But didn't Mayor Adams try to push back on that? The right to shelter?
Well, yes, recently has in terms of
some of his recent
bills he has to do and bringing in the immigrants. But, Eric has gone, left and right on this. And some are very upset with him. Although, Norman is one of my mentors. He's also one of the mayor's mentors. As a matter of fact, many people don't know, but Eric and Marcus Camby started 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Cares. I believe late 70s, early 80s. They made a huge impact in the police department. You would not have the diversity in the police department we have now without their work, but he found himself in great trouble. The department wanted him to throw him out, and Norman defended him. So they became, friends in that respect. Eric has been very strategic in the years. I think that's the only way you really become mayor in this town, if you're not a billionaire to begin with. And so we're very unhappy with some of the directions he's taken, but he has supported the Street Homelessness Advocacy Project. And the idea behind that, let me put that shortly, quickly, is that we know that for so many people that we see on the corners, they've been in and out of the shelters. And the shelters are dangerous for them. And they don't want to go there. They're not going to Bellevue again for intake. They don't want to be in these places. What we have now, to a very limited extent, we call them welcome hotels. We call them stabilization beds. The promise is we can get you into a single room with your own bath, with all the wraparound services. And hopefully over time, we can help you get to where you want to be in terms of what you think your needs are in respect to mental health, addiction, job training, education, and so forth. It's a long haul, but the problem is so severe, we can't expect any of our electeds to do it on their own, or our civil servants. every single New Yorker has to rise to this occasion. And that's what we're hoping to do here, is slowly but surely to build this pilot project into an all 5-borough neighborhood by neighborhood project, where people in the neighborhoods who know the homeless people on their corner and around the block can say to them, hey, let me talk to you. I can help you. I can call the Joint Command Center at the Department of Homeless Services, and we can get you a single bed and, go from there.
So in this way, we're trying to create, that's hopefully there, it is there, the heart of New York. Collectively, we do care for each other. And this is a concrete way where we can bridge the gap, in a sense, by, as you say, volunteers going out and meeting the people on the streets and offering the services that you're describing here. Are there enough of the housing that you're looking for available for no, it's not.
No,
so
exactly as you put it.
Right.
The underlying problem is the inaffordability of housing in this city. So many of our public service, whether they're teachers, whether they're cops, sanitation, whoever they're, bodega workers, where can they afford to live?
Right.
It's extremely problematic. And, that's the heart of everything here. Until we solve that problem, we're in, great difficulty here. And this has been a problem that's been mounting from decades. And in some respects, it goes all the way back to, releasing people from the psychiatric hospitals many years ago with the promise that there would be, community group homes. None of that
never happened. Right.
And so we've got so many people, they've been through a cascade of events, whether it was, any kind of addiction. We could talk about that at another time. People have addictions because they have needs that aren't being met. And that's some way in which they find, some degree of stability, so it's very
But
sad.
you're not blaming the homelessness.
No.
We want to make that clear to the audience here.
Exactly.
Yes, there are a group, a pool.
Exactly.
But
Yeah. And so many people we see, it's a cascade of events. It can be a divorce, it could be a job loss. We meet people on the streets, they were cops. They were in the military, many of them. They were teachers, they were artists, certainly. There's so many who have had really quite remarkable lives. But then others, were young people who were never given a chance. They were, looked at as criminals from, grade school on. And so many
formerly incarcerated.
Exactly. So much of that. And we have a history of that. It's so clear. You go back to the planned shrinkage, the redlining. People in the city, this is an incredibly racist city. People think it's a post-racial city. It's not. We really never had, the Northern Civil Rights Movement, to this day. Look at the COVID data. How Black and brown communities were hurt, more than anywhere else, even though we're seeing, great diversity in so many places now. Much of it, is nowhere near what we need to do.
Long residing New Yorkers will remember the SROs.
Yes, exactly.
Now, single room occupancy facilities. Now, in my neighborhood in the Upper West Side here, yes, we have a number, and they're not the same as they used to be. But you're not necessarily talking about going back to that, right? You're talking about something that involves more wraparound services as well, or explain the differences there.
Well, there are several levels. We're talking about now, when we're talking about, whether it's the shelters, which oddly enough, and we don't have enough of them, seem to be working for a lot of the immigrants, because as traumatized as they may have been in their journeys from wherever they're coming, so many of them were with their families and they're with people from villages that they come from, and they're just ready to go to work, and we need them. These folks can work. They want to work. We need the workers, so they're welcome, I believe, and they should be here. And we should take them in. But
the shelters are a perfectly fine facility, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
Get them going
temporarily, and then get them into housing. But then the other things that I'm talking about in terms of these welcome hotels, the stabilization beds, this is what we call as transitional housing. So none of this is long term. And at some point, we want to get people into permanent housing. Now, some of that permanent housing can be like the building I live in, the Prince George, which is one of the original buildings, supportive housing. The group was called Common Ground at the time, now called Breaking Ground, which does some of the homeless outreach along with a few other vendors in the 5 boroughs, in addition to what the city does through the Department of Homeless Services. But we need a huge amount of investment from the federal government. We've got to move the money, as the resolution sponsored by Kalina Rivera in the city council is called, from the military into municipal services. I mean, 53% of our tax dollars here in New York end up in the Pentagon. Right. You know, so we need to move that money in a very, very big way into huge investments in building housing. And as I said, that can be done with nonprofits of various sorts and various sizes. Some of it, that people have been highly impacted by homeless and highly traumatized and may need, you know, quite a long period of care. Those could be smaller group homes. But then we just need affordable housing, which is truly affordable, that is not built by developers who must make a profit. It's got to be some kind of very, very different kind of program.
Yeah, you're making some very, very profound points that need to be emphasized again and again. There are people out there who are in need, a small percentage, who probably at least temporarily need to be in an involuntary facility of like a mental hospital.
Well, actually, you know, with what we're doing with SHAP, with the Street Homeless, it's strictly
this is not
optional. This is totally voluntary.
An optional. But even Norm has mentioned too that you know, a few will need that, but we're not talking about mass incarceration.
No, not by any means.
We're not any stretch of the imagination.
In terms with SHAP, it's strictly voluntary, because we feel very strongly, you know, like people with any problem, until they recognize the problem, they really can't make inroads on this. So we believe this has to be entirely voluntary. People have to be ready for these services. And we understand there are people who are not ready. And we come across that all the time. Whether or not we have a bed available or not, there are people who are just not ready to come off the street.
Right.
But you're right. This is really not the huge number of homeless people. This is a number in the thousands, not the tens of thousands, who we might use the term intractable because they've been in and out and they have, you know, such great difficulties. And they really need, I mean, the kind of mental health services that even, you know, wealthy people in this city can no longer get. I mean, you know, medical care. I mean, here we go. Housing, medical care, education, arts and culture. We make it so hard for people to live.
Schools, libraries, etc.
Libraries,
you know. Exactly.
And the threat of cutting that budget, you know, losing a day at the library, closing the library, and the connection between libraries and homeless people. I mean, some of the librarians are the greatest, you know, homeless supporters in the city. You know, they know the people, they work with them over the years, you know, and we learn from them. And I have to say, we learn, you know, some of the folks, the outreach workers that we've been working with in the Department of Homeless Services, a little less so in the contract agencies, but they're really fantastic. You know?
Right.
So, but we do not have the resources.
And the resources you're saying the bulk of it has to come from the federal government. How much can the city do with what it has?
You know, right now we're having trouble with, you know, basic services. So no, and we need a lot more from the state. And we need so much from the federal, but no, I think we could definitely, you know, change the budget around a little bit. We're not shaving the police department. That could be a very good idea. And we got a lot of folks standing around making a lot of overtime, you know, at these parades. I don't know what we need all these folks for, you know. So we could reform the police department, I think.
Right. That's another. We've.
If not,
that's another connection. So these welcome hotels that you're talking about and transitional housing. When you talk about transitional, what are you talking about here? A few months?
We're talking about things that are getting people on a pathway to permanent housing,
which may take anywhere from when to when. it could be
Well,
6 months, a year,
they
2 years.
vary. They could vary for a couple of weeks to a couple of months. But you get into, like in my situation, supportive housing. That's permanent housing, right? That's permanent housing with services where people come in and they have caseworkers, and they can get help, through their lives if they need
So
it.
how does that concretely work in terms of working with the owners of these hotels, the managers, and so on, the develop? What sort of arrangements can you make so that you have more of these sort of places opening up? That's
a very good question, because although we call them welcome hotels, and some of them formerly hotels, are now owned by the city, and they are in fact city-owned transitional housing, right? But we need an awful lot more. And one of the things that we would like to push, and the city is not budged on this, we'd like to use eminent domain to take some of these huge buildings now that are sitting empty, that are easily transformed into transitional housing. And then look at the vacancy rate in office buildings. I mean, there's so many. These are easily.
How about Billionaires Row there on 57th Street?
Exactly. I mean,
it's vacant.
The vacancy rate around Times Square is 25%. Wall Street area, I think it's close to the 35%. I mean, and a lot of this is very, very easily convertible. But, we really have to, change so many other things too.
Yes.
Particularly when we start thinking about sustainability, we're still building straight up sliver buildings or, vertical buildings. This is a horror. We need terraces, setbacks. My building, we have a rooftop garden. It was a skyscraper when they built the Prince George in 1901 at 13 stories. Now we're surrounded by 70-story buildings going straight up. But we need setbacks, every few floors, every floor. So a much bigger footprint, much more air and light, to the tenants. But we also need the greening of these horizontal spaces so that you have your gardens, you have your compost, you have your little windmills, you have your solar panels. I mean, when you begin to burn out these horizontal spaces, rooftops, terraces, setbacks, you decrease the cost of heating and cooling tremendously. They're doing this in places around the world, and they have a very clear idea how to do this in Cuba. One of the great things that they have in Cuba is something that we've done here over the years, and luckily we've been able to save some of this community gardening that we've been able to save. I met down in Sancti Spiritus, one of the most brilliant organic farmers I've ever seen in my life. Scholars from all over the world come to visit this fellow, Alberto. I mean, he knows, it's millennial knowledge. He has a very good idea of what plant you put to this plant. You want to keep the bugs away from that one, and how to reutilize, you recycle.
Where is this again? Where is this garden? Zool, where is it?
Well, we have gardens all over the city, of course, still that we saved from the rubble that they once were. This is in Sancti Spiritus. But in every municipality in Cuba, this is one of the great things in the revolution that people, even, Fidel later in his life, recognized organic gardening, which is done on a community scale. So, so much of this produce is going to the schools, it's going to the hospitals, it's going to the people. So they really do have a great deal of produce available. It's hard to get milk and bread, and their salaries are not high enough to afford, meat all the time, but they don't have factory farming. If you eat meat, you taste that chicken or pork, which is a big thing, of course, in the Caribbean. And they grow, in their front yards. It's really a very different world. And oh my God, the fruits. I mean, people mango trees on the side of the road. I mean, you're not going to starve in Cuba.
Sounds good. Sounds wonderful. No, but we're talking about this transformative consciousness and connecting our better angels. And yet again and again, profit comes in. This is not where the money is, or certainly the developers and the Wall Street movers and shakers don't see what you've just described here as where they want to invest and put. How do we get to get them to do this, or how do we get the resources that we need?
Well, consciousness really is the word, Jim. I'm glad that you use it. And so we use it in two respects. So we want to use it in terms of class consciousness, because we do see that capitalism really is a scourge, that it does create great wealth for fewer and fewer. And these folks, they're building bunkers and planning settlements on the Mars because
Yeah.
they know we don't want them here anymore. Whatever country it is, they tell us, love it or leave it, but it's our planet. And they got a pretty good idea that they probably should leave it because we're not happy with them, and a lot of them are not happy either. Sad to say, I think there may be more class traders among the ultra rich than among the the working poor who think they're going to win the lottery or something. So go back to consciousness. So what does consciousness mean? How do we want to live? Do we want to live plugged into these screens, constantly distracted? Do we want to live by, whatever it is that we call success in terms of the schools that we go to, the neighborhoods that we live in? This one is good. This one was bad. What does it mean? What does a bad neighborhood mean? I mean, it's absurd. One group of people are bad and another not. No, we all can, be saints or sinners in one way or another. And I know, generally we do that in turn. We have our better instincts and our worse instincts. If we can learn, to think before reacting, and to learn to respond rather than to react, we can sort of slow down and think in terms of happiness and think in terms of what this wonderful writer Jean Liedloff called in her little book, the continuum concept, In Search of Happiness Lost, something that she discovered when she spent so much time with people in the Amazon.
Well, spend a few more minutes on that because I know that's been very, very influential in your life.
It has, and it's something that Gabor Mate refers to several times in his new big book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. It's really, it's really looking at, how do we, support each other, ourselves? How do we meet our needs? How do we distinguish between what we need and what we want? And what does that really mean? And so it's very basic, how do we care for a pregnant woman? How do we care for infants who really must have that in-arms experience and, must have their needs met through their early childhood, because all they can do is signal to us what they need. I'm hungry, I'm cold, whatever it might be, and we can just provide them what they need, as people did for millennia. Indigenous people all over the planet. Hey, look, Jim, we're all indigenous people, but mostly we're displaced indigenous people. Very few.
So it's recapturing the memory of this sense of community and giving and nurturing that you seem to be talking about. And in many cases, because of what we've done to so many people, institutionalized them in the criminal justice system and so on, they haven't learned that. It's been taken from them, and they need to relearn it or learn the process that you're talking about, which of course they're not getting. But the program you're talking about, the housing advocacy program, seems to be a very concrete way of trying to accomplish that.
Yes.
Right. And then the other thing, though, is still the people. It's so easy for so many people to respond, well, hey, they're getting put up in a hotel here. Why can't I? And all that sort of stuff. And the rich and so on. We don't want these people to hang around our neighborhood and so on. So that's the other level of consciousness that you have to try to work with, with a whole other group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, very different consciousness. So we want to build to class consciousness, and maybe we have to start with class consciousness because we really have to organize at a level where we're going to say, we want our tax dollars spent differently. I go out with the Granny Peace Brigade and some of my friends, the Raging Grannies, and our Veterans for Peace group, and Move the Money and others. And we do a penny poll sometimes, in Union Square, around the city. And what we'll do is we'll have a little table with these tubes set up where you can put your pennies, and we give people bags of pennies, bags of 20 pennies. And the tubes are labeled military, education, infrastructure, environment, arts and culture, and so forth. And we say to folks, here, this is your tax dollars. How do you think it should be divided up? Well, let me tell you, James, it's never, ever 53% for the military. It's not even half that. And there's so much money that people really do want to put into the environment, into education, into parks, into arts and culture. I mean, people really want to, into healthcare. Oh my goodness, and most of all, really housing, because that affects everybody in this town. And, I was talking a little bit about, what I call ziggurats, building these buildings where you have all these terraces and all these gardens and all these berms, and you really can do independent energy if you have, solar panels and little windmills and, compost bins. I mean, it's really quite remarkable what we really could do. And people are doing in cities around the world, and people are doing in villages in Cuba. I mean, we really can do these things. Like Ralph Nader has said for so many years, I mean, all these solutions are sitting on the shelf. I mean, we really have a good idea to solve all the problems. It's just we're prevented reaching these solutions because there are a few folks who say, I want to be a trillionaire first.
There you go. And in the remaining few minutes we have here, how do we reach you and Norm so you can volunteer for, as I will be?
Thank you. Yeah.
How do you do that?
People could.
I know our audience could be interested.
Yeah, no, but if people would please email us at shap@gmail.com. So that's SHAP for the Street Homeless Advocacy Project, SHAP@gmail.com. SHAP@gmail.com.
And you have a meeting every Thursday, right?
Right now,
Right
this was a pilot last August. And until recently, we only had 5 groups. One going up to the Bronx, one going to the Penn Station area, another to Union Square, one to South Ferry. And now recently we've added Harlem and Brooklyn. And very soon we'll be adding both Grand Central and Jamaica Station in Queens. And eventually, as I say, we want this to be a neighborhood by neighborhood, 5-borough project where people are working where they live when they want to, with a group as, big or small. I mean, we do it in 2s. Often we still do it with someone from Department of Homeless Services, but now we're being able to call in separately on our own. I mean, right now, anybody can call 311 from a link phone, from their cell phones, and help anybody in the street at any time. You get to 311 and you're asking for the Joint Command Center at the Department of Homeless Services. You're with a person who wants to be placed in a single room in a stabilization bed. They want to get their SNAP, their food stamps. They want to get onto disability. They want to get a whole variety of services. It's here. It's here for them. They don't need to have their documents. There's so much the city has available if people can help the folks who need the help the most, many of whom just can't manage to do it on their own.
Absolutely. And it's really, I've been to the meetings, really well organized. You've got your act together on this. So we hope all New Yorkers will participate in this program. This has been such an enlightening time and hour, and we've run out of time. The only criticism I would have is that you've been too modest, Zool. No, people, my audience, you must come down to demonstrations where Zool, as a performing artist, will be, and he is, may I say, the Abby Hoffman of our generations. He really pushes us and enlightens us and creates this politics of joy. You are a joy to know and a joy to work with, and I look forward to many, many years of that friendship and being our comrade, my comrade, and being on this show.
Love you, Jim. Love BD, and looking forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you so much. And thank you all very, very much for watching us on The Radical Imagination this week. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.